There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is a middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone. Hey guys, Alf here, back with another Analyzing Twilight Zone episode, and we're finally at the first episode, and the official pilot called Where Is Everybody? This episode premiered on CBS on October 2nd, 1959, and it was written by Rod Serling, directed by Robert Stevens. Originally, since it was the pilot, they had someone else do the narration, so when it originally aired, it aired without Rod Serling. It was narrated by a guy named Westbrook Van Voorhees, but he could not be he was not available for any of the later episodes, so they couldn't find anybody to do it. Eventually, Serling said that he would do it, and thank God, because he ended up being the perfect person for it. But eventually they went back and re-recorded. He re-recorded the narration himself, and added all these other things like a reference to the fifth dimension and other things he changed. I'm going to show you the original narration now.
There is a sixth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the sunlight of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area that might be called the Twilight Zone. The place is here. The time is now. And the journey into the shadows that we are about to watch could be our journey.
So that guy's voice didn't work out so well. Rod Serling just has a certain cadence and a voice that lends itself to these kind of stories. It's it's kind of a good thing that this guy had other obligations and couldn't record more episodes, because it was better off that Rod Serling took over for doing the narration and stuff. Also, this episode was the only episode of the Twilight Zone filmed at Universal Studios, because after this it was MGM took over, and all the other episodes are filmed at MGM Studios. And another thing of note before I get into the story is that this was not the original script for the pilot. The original script written for the pilot was a story called The Happy Place, and it was about a society where people are executed once they reach the age of 60 because they're no longer considered useful to society. But the executive at CBS rejected this story for the pilot, thinking it was too dark, and it's kind of sad he never went back to do it. If I can ever end up finding the script for this, I'll do an episode on it. Yeah, another thing is that there was a different ending written in the script, and but I'm going to get to that at the end. And let me get to describing the story first. So the story begins with a man in a U.S. Air Force flight suit walking down a dirt road alone. And he comes to a diner and checks it out. He walks in. And he looks around, there's nobody there. It seems like the place is open and in operation, but there's nobody around, and he's, yelling out like, "Hey, hello, I'm here, you got a customer?" Nobody answers, so he goes in the back, and he's like, "You got a paying customer here, where is everybody?" But nobody answers him, and then suddenly he hears a tea kettle whistle, and he comes out and he sees that there's a tea kettle whistling going off. He turns it off, and he's like, that just leads him to believe, hey, there's people here, right? That somebody had to set this. And he was like, hello. Nobody answers. Eventually, he has himself a cup of coffee. He goes in his pocket and realizes he has money. And he's like, you got a paying customer, But oddly enough, nobody wants to answer. So he starts talking to himself, and he realizes that he doesn't remember anything about himself. He doesn't remember his name. He doesn't remember who he is, where he's from. The last thing he remembers is just suddenly walking down that dirt road. So, yeah, and then he's looking for answers, he's looking for people. So he eventually leaves the diner and he starts roaming around the town and, sees that there's nobody around. It's like the middle of the day and there's no one. Then he sees, he looks over and he sees a woman in a truck and he's like, hey, hey, I've been looking around, nobody's around, it's really weird. I'm glad I found you, what's going on? And as he gets closer to the truck, he realizes that, he opens the door of the truck and the lady falls out and realizes that it was a mannequin. And, the truck is like from a mannequin company, I guess, in the middle of delivering mannequin. But still, nobody. He keeps roaming around the town and eventually stumbles upon a theater. He goes in the theater and he looks to see if there's anybody there. There's nobody sitting or there. But as he's looking around, all of a sudden a film starts, and the projector starts running. And he's like, oh shit, so he runs up and he sticks his head in the projector window and he's like, hello, is anybody there? I've been, it's crazy, I've been looking around. But there's nobody there either. So eventually this starts getting to him and he starts, losing his mind a bit. At this point, I'm going to say that the rest of the story is basically a spoiler. So spoiler alert, if you're going to watch the episode, before I do this is a good point to stop and watch the episode. But if not, and you don't care, you can continue watching and I will ruin the story for you. So, yeah, there's a point where he sees a payphone and he gets inside the payphone. He's calling, he's trying to call people, get to the operator, but an electronic voice answers, right? It's like a recording. And he's like talking to the recording like, hey, and then he realizes, he's like, I didn't, like, it says the number you dialed isn't in operation. And he's like, I didn't dial a number, I dialed for the operator, so it should be going to an operator, but instead it's going to this recorded message. It's not working. Then and he starts kind of losing it at this point, and then all of a sudden he's like trapped in the phone booth and he's banging against it. But it's not really that he's trapped, like, anybody who's been in these old school phone booths know that they open inward, but it's because of his panic and dismay and general chaoticness that's going on, and of the thought that there's nobody around and then somebody's fucking with him or something. He totally forgets that the door opens inward, so he just keep pushing it, going crazy and, yelling, hey, is anybody gonna help me out of here, this and that. Eventually he does realize that, you pull the door inward to open it, and he opens it and gets out.
This isn't funny anymore. I don't like this chance of getting the door.
There's a funny piece of trivia about this scene is Rod Serling wrote this in because this happened to him. He was at an airport and had to make a phone call, so he got in the phone booth and he made a call. And halfway through his call, he heard over the intercom that they were boarding for his flight at the moment. So he kind of like freaked out because he thought he was going to miss the flight. And in his bit of a panic, he started pushing on the door and thought it was stuck. And he was like, oh, fuck, what's going on? He felt like the door got stuck and he couldn't get out. So he kind of panicked and he kept pushing on it. And then eventually he waved someone over to help him. And the guy came over and kicked the door. And that was when he realized, oh, yeah, the door opens inward. Because when he kicked the door, obviously it kicked it inward and it opened easily. So he was probably, and he was like, oh, shit, it opens inward, duh. And he said it felt humiliating, but he wrote it into the story because it's kind of like the stupid things that happen to you when you're panicking, right? Yeah, eventually it becomes nighttime. He's been roaming around all day and still hasn't found anybody. And he's starting to lose his mind, and he's running around just yelling like, where is everybody? Why isn't anybody here? And I think there's a part in the theater where he runs into a mirror and breaks it, bounces off of it, breaks it. And that's just how nuts he's getting. He breaks a clock and he's just flipping out and losing his mind. And then, this is the definite spoiler. This is where the twist ends up that he wakes, the scene changes and he's like banging against the little clock and breaking it. And I think at the beginning of the story, it kind of links to the beginning of the story, because at the beginning of the story in the diner, he knocks over a little clock, a timer, like an egg timer, and it breaks it, and it breaks at 6:15. But when we're flashing to a different scene, we see that he's banging on a little clock that stopped at 6:15 as well. And we realize, it zooms out and you realize he's in an isolation chamber and it's part of like a military simulation or experiment, and the military's talking, and they're like, yeah, this was the amount of a test to see how people can deal with isolation for a trip to the moon. You have to realize this was 10 years before we did go to the moon, and they basically said he was in there for like 448 hours, something like that. In all honesty, we realized later on that at minimum speed, we can reach the moon, orbit it 10 times, and come back in a third of that time, which is, that's what he said. He was like, oh, we can, the amount of time it takes and the amount of isolation it takes for somebody to fly to the moon, orbit 10 times, and come back. And so they're basically saying that, that it might be impossible, or we'd have to think of the repercussions of having somebody alone in a little box floating through space for 448 hours, That's a nutty amount of time to be alone. So basically that's what happened. He was in the isolation chamber for this experiment to try to see what happens if somebody tries to make it to the moon. And in his isolation, he probably lasted a long time, but eventually he was alone and didn't talk to anybody for so long, and had sensory deprivation, or just basically no stimulation for so long that his mind just concocted this town to kind of express the isolation to himself, and he was just alone in this town with nobody around, and it was driving him crazy. But he got out of it. He's all right. But yeah, that's where the story ends, with him going in a stretcher, and he says he looks up while he's getting carried away from in the stretcher. He looks up at the moon, and he says, don't go away up there. We'll be seeing you very soon. So it was basically 10 years before we made it to the moon. It was basically saying like, hey, we're going to go to the moon soon. I think that was, I don't know if that was already in people's minds or if they kind of predicted that, but I think it was already in people's minds, right, at that point. The original ending was supposed to have, the original script originally had him reach into his pocket and find a movie ticket, which was from the movie theater that he went to in his hallucination, which would have proved that some of it was true, or somehow he traveled there. That would have lent itself to a bit more of a sci-fi-y kind of story. But the studios thought they wanted it to be a little more grounded in reality, so Rod Serling cut that part out. Even when they were filming, the actor who plays the main character, whose name is Mike Ferris, the actor's name is Earl Holliman, he thought that he should rip a page out of the phone book and put that in his pocket, and that at the end he could pull that out of his pocket. So it's funny how he came up with a similar type of ending, because it just seems like the right thing for this story, right? At least if you look at later Twilight Zones, it's very Twilight Zone-y to end it that way. But again, they didn't take that idea either, because the studios wanted it to be grounded in reality. Yeah, I think the point of this story is just kind of to show, you might think you're a hermit, you might think you hate people, you might think you'd be able to live alone for a certain amount of time, but in the end, you probably can't. It would probably drive you mad. People need, we're a communal species. We need people. We need to communicate and express ourselves to other people, and need the back and forth. I think also it's a thing about, we can't go on without stimulation. I think that's for every living being, right? Living beings need stimulation. It's not a very deep story, but it's just kind of a story of a warning of, what lies up ahead, what the dangers are of traveling through space alone, in a box, in a little flying box that'll take you to the moon. This is a good one. It's done very well. The directing in it is cool. The cinematography is really good. There's like a thing you can note if you pay attention closely, you'll see that when they're zoomed in close to him are times where he's taken up most of the screen. It's kind of like you don't see much around, so there's not much emptiness, and you kind of get a feeling of hope at that point. They're like, oh, there's other people around, there's other things around. But every time he realizes he's alone and there's no one around, the screen backs up and he takes up very little of the screen. So you see a lot of vast emptiness, and it just gives you more of the feeling of being alone and empty. And then later on, when he's starting to lose his mind, you see the cameras start getting cocked, right? You see like everything's diagonal or just slightly off, and you get a lot of that, and a lot of or close-ups to his face where he's like sweaty and he looks like he's lost it. The dude does a good job acting in this, and it's a very well-produced story. I know Charles Beaumont, who ended up being a writer for the Twilight Zone, read the script and said that it's not a story he hadn't heard before, and it was just, he didn't find anything special about it. But upon watching it filmed and watching the episode, he said the quality of the filming was so good and the way the story was told was so good that it made it seem fresh and new and breathed life into it. And I agree with that. I think like me explaining this story is probably not that great and it seems like just a generic tale. But if you watch it and watch it portrayed, it does give you certain emotions and feelings and is well done. Like I said, like I was talking about the camera angles and the way they filmed certain things lends to you feeling these, feeling what he's feeling. And it works out very well. It's good for a first episode. There's way better Twilight Zone episodes, but the first season was just the beginning, right? We'll work through these, and we'll find some better episodes. But in the end, this is not a bad episode. It's a good one. You should watch it, and it's a good way to kick off the show and give people kind of a general idea of what the show is going to be like. I hope you come back for that, and thank you for watching this video, and talk to you guys soon. See ya.
All right, who's the wise guy who locked the door? It's a great gag. How about a hand, somebody? A little assistance. How about it? This is an absolutely hysterical town, and I'm growing very fond of it.